We've talked about classic story structure, but that mostly focused on plot, and we need to flesh out our stories with quite a bit more than just that. We're going to discuss four of the overarching key story elements, with more on the way, that answer the who, what, when, where, and how of telling a story. You'll note one W is missing, but don't fret, that'll come in part two. Hi, hello, welcome in. I'm Jerica, and I'm an editor, writer, and all-around content creator, and today we're discussing character, setting, plot, and point of view, or POV. While there are loads of key story elements, these are the big four that kind of affect all parts of the story, whereas the ones that we'll cover in part two kind of nestle into these ones. Or they're more about word choice and sentence structure than they are about the content of the story. I struggled to decide if conflict should be a part of this part or into the next one, but ultimately I decided conflict is part of plot and part of character. It also kind of falls into the why of the story, which has a second half. But I feel like I've put the cart before the horse, so let's figure out these four elements before we start talking about those ones. For each of these story elements, we're going to look at the definition, some examples, and then some considerations to keep in mind. Character, or who the story is about. The definition, or my current, for the purposes of this video, definition of character. Character is all of the people, or animals, entities, aliens, trees of your story. It's your cast. This includes things like name, occupation, personality traits, motivations, and some characters are more important to flesh out than others, but we'll get to that in considerations. So let's look at a couple of examples. In a romance story, your protagonist might be a man down on his luck who just moved to a new town for a new job that happened to fall through. He thinks if his career can't make him happy, maybe love can. It's time to give it a try again. And a love interest character might be the man that lives next door. He's charming, good-looking, and has a very cute dog. His apartment is a little disorganized, quite the opposite of our protagonist. He's focused on his career, but maybe his mind can be changed. In a fantasy story, your protagonist might be the only person in town willing to go on an adventure. She doesn't hold the confidence of the town, but her confidence in herself is enough. Or maybe it isn't. And then you might have a mentor character, like her grandma, who has always taught her to fake it until she makes it. Her final words are words of wisdom to the protagonist as she sets out on her perhaps doomed adventure to save the kidnapped child. In a horror story, your protagonist might be a victim. A single mom of two taken from a dark parking lot after work. Her goal is to return to her children, and her captor isn't ready for her ability to get under his skin. And your antagonist character might be a serial killer. He takes women who look like his late wife, who was killed by a serial killer. His goal is to relive those last days with his wife. But then he brutally murders those women in the ways that he saw in the crime photos. Some considerations for building out your characters. First, you'll notice that I was calling these characters different things. Protagonists, antagonists, mentors, foils, love interests, sidekicks. There's lots of different types of characters that you may want in your story. Of course, you don't necessarily need all of these characters. They don't all fit all genres and all stories. In fact, technically, you can tell a story with a single character, just a protagonist, because your antagonist may not be a character at all. So let's look at a couple of definitions for these types of characters. A protagonist is basically your main character. Many people will call this a hero, but your main character is the protagonist, whether it's a hero or not. The antagonist is a character, maybe, that is simply opposite your protagonist. They antagonize them, they push against them, they're the biggest thing holding them back from their goals. Of course, it's possible to have multiple antagonists as well. A love interest is a character that holds somebody's interest in love or romantic desire. Usually we use this only for the protagonist, but there's no reason not to talk about love interests of other characters. Or if you happen to have kind of a group of protagonists and the group is the protagonist, you might have multiple love interests, and your love interests might even be within that group. A foil is another character that contrasts your protagonist, or usually your protagonist. You can have foils for any of your characters, though. This isn't the same as an antagonist, although your antagonist may also be a foil. It's really just another character that plays off the protagonist well, that kind of like shows the opposite traits. They're not necessarily antagonizing, they may even be the thing that holds the character together. You know, if you have a very anxious main character, your foil may be their rock. And a mentor is a character that provides support and wise words at some point in the journey or throughout. Often the mentor gets left behind at some point in some way, but not always. So the next consideration to look at is the size of your cast, and this often hinges on your genre, probably more than anything else, but also just the type of story and how many characters you need to tell it. It also hinges a little bit on the length of your story. If you're writing a short story versus a novella versus a novel versus a doorstopper of a novel, you're going to be able to fit more characters in and do them more justice with more words. Within this idea of the size of your cast, you'll also want to consider what your main cast versus your side cast is. It's a very different story to have a small main cast of 1 or 2 characters that interact with a lot of side characters versus a large main cast and not so many characters that can kind of be left unfleshed out. Another consideration when it comes to size of cast is actually your audience. If you are writing for a younger audience, you're probably going to want to go with a smaller cast. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, and that also doesn't mean that just because you're writing for an adult audience means that you need to have a huge cast. That's also not necessary. It's just something to kind of keep in mind that younger audiences will have a harder time keeping track of large casts. However, there are loads of avid young readers out there that want large casts, so it doesn't mean that you can't write those stories for them. However, I would say if you're writing, like, middle grade children's books, you may want to pay more attention to it than if you're writing young adult or new adult. When it comes to examining individual characters during the planning and writing of your story, we want to make sure that we're creating well-rounded characters. This is most important for your main cast. Sometimes you can let side characters remain a little more flat. But what the heck does well-rounded or flat even mean? A well-rounded character is unique with flaws and quirks. They're distinctive all the way down to their voice, the way that they speak. Whereas a flat character is more likely to be a stereotype or a trope and kind of hinge on one personality trait, or maybe even one physical trait. A character that comes off perfect is boring. One that perfectly fulfills a stereotype or trope without having anything to set them apart is boring. They can be familiar. In fact, often it's good that they are. But they need something to make them specific to this story. Why them? Why now? We should, however, consider tropes and stereotypes and whether or not we want to subvert them. And also whether or not this trope or stereotype is problematic. And of course, we must take special care when creating characters that are marginalized, especially if they're different from us. When it comes to using tropes and stereotypes in character creation, it can be a really good shorthand to your readers, especially for side characters that we're not going to spend a lot of time with. But we still want to keep all of those considerations in mind. And let's talk a little bit more about those side characters. Often you don't have to flesh out side characters as much as you do your main characters, simply because they're going to be on the page for less time, and therefore you just don't have as much time to flesh them out. So what you really want to focus on is their purpose in the story. And if they aren't adding anything, do they really even need to be there? Do they help or hinder the main character? Do they provide necessary information or backstory? Do they deepen emotional resonance? Maybe they reveal theme. Maybe they accentuate a character, perhaps they're a foil. Finally, characters need to have room to grow and change. This harkens back to the idea of a perfect character. A key part of a good story is that the character has changed by the end. Maybe for the better, maybe for the worse, maybe just different, but they have changed. So start your character somewhere they can change from and consider what your story is going to do to them and how it will help them get there. Which, of course, is a perfect time to talk about plot. Plot. What the story is about. First, our working definition. Simply put, plot contains the events of the story. It's all the obstacles along the way, all the different bits that we talked about when we talked about classic story structure. And you can look at this as kind of the overall plot, and you can also look at it in a zoomed in way for each chapter or each scene even. These smaller pieces of plot I would call plot points. Let's look at some examples. A romance plot might look like a gym crush story where two women start as rivals at the gym, but slowly fall in love with each other, ending with a happily ever after. And a plot point in that story might look like Jenny hits a deadlift personal best, and that sends Connie into a silent rage. A fantasy story plot may look like a young prince is kidnapped and the main character and his adventuring party must travel the land to find and retrieve him. A classic epic journey. A plot point in that story might look like the roguish sidekick overhears a clue in the tavern which sets them on the prince's trail. A comedy horror story plot might look like a family moves into a new house in a new province, but it turns out the previous family hasn't exactly left. They're haunting it and refuse to leave. The two families eventually learn to work together. A haunted house with a happy twist. A scene plot point in this story might look like the ghost mother has moved the living mother's jewelry, making her late for an important event. Some considerations for plot. Plot drives narrative. Each plot point should be challenging the characters or otherwise moving them toward or stopping them from moving toward their goals. Plot points can also reveal things that change the way you view the events that are happening. Plot is really where all of the other elements exist. The order of plot points, how they take characters further and closer to their goals, and the way they interact with the time and place that the whole story is happening are all important considerations when planning this plot. Plot points all fall into a piece of that classic story structure. They are the exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion. They are what create the opportunity for change. Without plot points and their obstacles and triumphs, you don't really have a story. You might have written something, but it's not a story. So you need to ask yourself about the purpose of telling this story. How can you make the story interesting with tension and release? What order should these events happen in, and in what order should they be revealed to the reader? How will the status quo change? How will your plot force your characters to change? Next, we move on to setting, the when and where the story takes place. And our working definition really is just that. It's the when and where a story takes place. The main setting covers the story overall, but every scene is going to have its own setting. The scale of details will change from story to story, all the way from days and houses to decades and galaxies. Let's look at a couple of examples. A romance's main setting might be Ottawa, Ontario, Canada in 2019. However, a scene might take place at a Bridgehead coffee shop on February 2nd at 2 p.m. A fantasy story's main setting might look like Avian Lake Village and surrounding area, a year similar to Earth's 1300s. An individual scene might take place in the Phoenix's Glade at midnight. And a horror story's main setting might look like a house and surrounding grounds in central Ontario in a contemporary setting, somewhere in the 2020s. An individual scene might take place in a kitchen at 9 a.m. And now for some considerations when planning your setting. It's possible that your setting is a single house over the course of the week if you're telling a haunted house story. However, if you're telling a story of an epic journey, you may be talking about a whole continent and months of travel. This then affects the scale of your individual scenes. In a haunted house, you may have a scene that takes place in a room, whereas in those larger scales, your scene could possibly take place in just a room, but also just knowing the city might be enough if you're doing kind of like a shopping montage or something like that. The time and place of your story can set some pretty stark limitations, particularly on things like language, technology, and culture. If you're writing in science fiction or fantasy, you might have a lot more room to play around with these things, but you'll still want to consider things like climate and technology and the new or different cultures of planets and future us. However, if you're working on a contemporary story, you may not have to think about this too much, but it's still really important. Something contemporary you have to make sure fits in with the slang and cultural phenomena of the time. Whereas if you're working on something historic, you need to make sure that you are doing your research. Even if it's just back to your childhood, you can't just work off your memory. People who read historical fiction expect a certain level of specificity in technology, and language, and culture. Particularly, you really can't be referencing things that haven't happened yet, unless you're doing a certain type of storytelling, but that's besides the point. If you're doing something that maybe takes inspiration from past decades or centuries of our time, but you're still working in a fictional place, like maybe you're doing fantasy that's somewhat like the medieval era, you have a little bit more room to play around as long as you're consistent. Finally, rather than setting simply a static setting, you do really have to pay attention to timeline, how long your story takes. Because if it's going across a week, not a lot is going to change, but if it's happening over months or years or decades, there's going to be a lot of change in those other things that we've been considering. Things like seasons and people are going to change and age, and things in the world are going to change and age and grow or fall. And now the kind of odd one out. POV, or how the story is told, although there's a lot more to how. Our working definition of POV, or point of view, is the perspective the story is told from. The way this most notably shows up in the writing is whether or not the narrator is using the pronoun I, or only uses she, he, they, or if you're getting a little experimental, maybe we, or us, or you. POV is talking about who is telling the story. It may be a character, it may be some omniscient narrator, it may be somewhere in between those two things. The second main piece of POV is how much knowledge that narrator has. So are they omniscient? They know all, including everything inside every character's head? Or are they a single character who only knows what's in their own head? Or are they somewhere in the middle where they're outside of the characters in your story, but maybe only have access to one or two characters' minds? There is a third piece, which is tense, whether this is being told in the moment, if it is being told as if it has already happened, and a little more experimentally, if it's being told as if it's about to happen. Rather than going with genres on this one, I'm just going to give kind of like a definition of a point of view and then a sentence that might be in that story. So the first one is first person, present tense, unreliable. This looks like I close my laptop and stand to leave when Jenny walks in because I don't want to deal with her rudeness. Third person, past tense, omniscient. This looks like as the lilies blew in the field and the salmon raced up the river, Sally and John sat comfortably on their porch watching the sunset. Third person, past tense, close. This looks like she took her first step toward the edge of the cliff with thoughts of fear and exhilaration flitting through her mind. Some considerations when choosing your point of view. A story can be told from the perspective of an outside narrator. It would use he, she, they, and no I. Or a character in the story, often the protagonist, and they will use I as well as she, her, and they. Far less commonly, we get into things like second person or imperative voice, which uses you as the main pronoun, or your narrator might be a group of people that uses we and us. POV also refers to how much knowledge the narrator holds, so they might be all-knowing, which is called omniscient. If they're third person but they have access to one or two characters, this is called close. And you may also have reliable versus unreliable, so narrators who only speak fact, and narrators who have an opinion of their own or may not be telling all of the truth, or the truth at all. When we're considering what POV works best for our story, one of the first things to consider is how zoomed out we want things to be. With a first-person POV, we can only tell what that one character perceives and sees. We can move into a multi-POV and have multiple first-person perspectives, but in those moments, we still only have access to what that one character is experiencing. If the character can't know it, neither can the reader. On the flip side, a third-person omniscient point of view gives us the opportunity to see the entire world, but that leaves less time for that interiority. However, it may also, and usually does, give access to the inside of every character's mind. And of course, there's everything in the middle, where we get access to some characters' minds and not others, where we're following closely but we're still outside a character, so we may notice things in the environment around them that they don't notice, but we're still stuck in the place with them. There are generally some expectations based on genre, but you're always welcome to play around with these things. For example, in a heavy world-building or lore-focused fantasy, third-person omniscient is going to generally work a lot better because you can talk about things that the characters aren't currently doing or thinking about. You're also likely to have a larger cast, so being able to see all of the characters kind of at the same time is helpful. A more emotional story that is really focused on a single character's plight can absolutely be told from third person, but will feel more intimate in first person, and you'll have a lot more access to that interiority, and you won't be focusing on things outside of that character or far away from that character. Of course, there's always opportunity to experiment and try the opposite or slip into multi-POV to explore a large cast from a first-person point of view. The key is to make sure that you're making that choice with this knowledge. You're making it a purposeful choice, not just falling into what feels easiest for you to write. And in conclusion, these 4 elements form a great base to begin planning and outlining your story, and there is still so much more left to explore within them. With well-rounded characters, a clear beginning, middle, and end, a time and place for the story to happen, and a clear perspective from which to view them through, you have a pretty good place to start writing from. Even if you don't come up with a scene-by-scene outline, nailing down some haphazard broad strokes within these 4 categories will help keep you on track during your writing, even if you're more of a discovery writer. Please ask me all your questions about any of the minutiae of these 4 key elements in the comments down below, and I will be sure to at least attempt to answer them. And remember that I have more coming for things like conflict, theme, motif, tension, pacing, lots. And let me know which of these 4 elements you'd like to see a deeper dive into first. I'm kind of leaning towards point of view, but I want to give you what you want. And as always, I hope you enjoyed. I had a blast. Catch you next time. Bye! Whoa, my heat is blowing cold air on me. Plot? Shh. And your antagonist killer might be a... Nope. I'm gonna start all of that over again. The time and place your Tory fuck.